Welcome to the Century Foundation. We're so happy to have you all here this evening. My name is Audrey McQuider, and I am a summer scholar here at TCF. The Century Foundation is a progressive policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. And we are celebrating our 100th anniversary this year, which is awesome. So feel free to clap. Yay. Awesome. So as you walked in, there were save the dates for our Centennial Gala on October 24th. Stay tuned for updates and check out more information on our website on sponsorships at tcf.org. So today's event is the first event in TCF Summer Think, Drink, Mingle series. We strongly encourage you to stick around for the drink and mingle part, which is, pretty fun. After the discussion, for some wine and cheese in the next room over here. And also join us for the conversation on Twitter at tcf.org, and you can feel free to use the hashtag housing segregation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rick Hollenberg. Yay.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And if you want to respond to something someone else said, that's fine.
All right, thank you, Audrey, and great to be with you all this evening. So the routine here is we will drink and mingle, but first think, and we're going to think about a pretty weighty topic tonight, which is the policies that divide us, segregation and gentrification in the 21st century. So the discussion is related to the release of a new report that I think you all have a copy of, that Kimberly Quick and I wrote, and is being released today, calling Attacking the Black-White Opportunity Gap that comes from residential segregation. So I am just going to give a few opening remarks to give a sense of why we should all care about this important issue. And I'm really excited, though, for the panel that we're going to have that will be led by Tabby Cortese, one of our summer scholars. So I like pictures, and so I'm going to just talk about three of the figures that are in the report, figures 1, 2, and 3, that go to the question of why we should all be deeply concerned about the high levels of segregation in this country, particularly between African Americans and whites, and why it poses such a problem for racial inequality. So I want to start with figure 1, which shows that the black-white income gap is significant, but the black-white wealth gap, that is your savings, your net worth, is much, much larger. So the black median household income is 59% of white income, which is bad enough. But the wealth gap is just extraordinary in this country. So African American households on average only have about 8% of the wealth of white families. Normally, obviously, when a family's income rises, they're able to accumulate more wealth, but given discrimination against African Americans, the same pattern doesn't hold. Now, part of that has to do with the legacy of slavery in this country, that African Americans were robbed of the opportunity to create wealth and hand it down over generations. But much of it, this wealth gap, has to do with housing segregation. So the homes that people own are typically the largest asset for any family. And because of racial segregation and white prejudice, the homes in predominantly African-American neighborhoods appreciate at slower rates than they do for whites. And so that is this wealth gap is really the first reason to care about racial segregation. Figure 2 shows that low-income African Americans are much more likely to attend high-poverty schools than low-income whites are. So fewer than 1 in 5 poor African Americans have a chance to go to a predominantly middle-class school where opportunities are generally better, compared to about a half of poor whites who are in a position to attend those middle-class schools, where the teachers are likely to be more experienced, the curriculum is stronger. And so this is another way in which racial segregation impedes the opportunities of African Americans. Third figure I want to mention has to do with employment and earnings. And if there's any good news in this report, it's that when racial segregation in a community declines, we see better outcomes for African Americans in those moderately segregated areas. So figure 3 shows the difference between the gaps between whites and African Americans on unemployment and on earnings, and we see that the gaps are smaller in those communities where racial segregation has been reduced. So in short, the point I want to leave you with is that racial residential segregation is a central source of racial inequality in America. So people of goodwill who want to address opportunity gaps by races have to pay careful attention to racial segregation. So the rest of the report we'll get into in the discussion, of a panel discussion. We are going to get into the question of how we got to this terrible predicament, the ways in which government policies systematically fostered racial segregation in this country. And then in, I guess you could say, Elizabeth Warren style, we've got a plan. We've actually got 11 ideas for how to address racial segregation, and some evidence that some of these ideas have had the ability to make some progress in certain communities. So, but before I turn it over to Tabitha, I want to take a moment of personal privilege and single out one of the panelists, Kimberly Quick, who was my co-author in this report, and who you'll hear from in a moment. For the past 4 years, she has been a wonderful colleague of mine at the Century Foundation. She is about to head off to Harvard Law School in the fall, and I think you will see soon when you hear her insights on the different issues that are going to come up, why we are going to miss her so much in the future. So thank you, and Tabitha, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come here today and learn more about racial segregation and gentrification. Is this working? My name is Tabby Cortese, and I'm a K-12 education scholar here for this summer. I'll be moderating today's panel, and I'm really excited to learn more about housing segregation because there's a lot that I could definitely learn. And I'm really interested in learning its implications on the state of the community's health, education, and policing. This is an issue that's important to me because I grew up in Williamsburg, which many of you may be familiar with. I've seen a lot of displacement, and that's why I'm really excited to hear about what all of these wonderful panelists have to say. So with that said, I'm going to introduce everyone. First, I would like to introduce Lorraine Collins. Lorraine Collins is the Director of Public Policy and External Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners in the New York City office, which is just downstairs on the 11th floor. She has done extensive work building a public policy strategy to address affordable housing and community development issues in New York. Next, I would like to introduce Braden Crooks. Braden is the co-founder of Designing the We. a social impact design studio positioned within the fields of social innovation and community-driven social, cultural, and economic development. They have designed the Undesigned the Red Line, which is an interactive exhibit, workshop series, and curriculum that explores the history of structural racism, classism, and how these designs compounded each other from the 1938 redlining maps until today. Next, I would like to introduce Kimberly Quick. Kimberly Quick is a senior policy associate here at the Century Foundation and the co-author with Rick Kallenberg on TCF's latest report on housing, attacking the black-white opportunity gap that comes from segregation. So it's the report that you all have. And lastly, I would like to introduce Marie Winfield. Marie Winfield is on the board of directors for the Fair Housing Justice Center. She works in law, focusing on land use, zoning, community planning, and served as the president of the East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust Board of Directors. So this is obviously an impressive group of people with very extensive knowledge. So my first question is going to go to Kimberly. Kimberly, could you share a historical context of how we got to the state of residential segregation?
Sure. I also want to echo my thanks for everyone on this panel. You guys are such wonderful experts and inspirations to my work and to Rick's work. The historical context is really key to understanding where we are today, and I think I always like to start this conversation by pointing out that segregation is a tool of white supremacy. It was intentionally implemented by racists in order to over-police, divide, surveil, and divest from Black and brown communities. It started, racial zoning and racial segregation wasn't always the case. There are a number of examples, early examples, where there were some diverse communities, but after Reconstruction, racial segregation intentionally started gaining popularity. There were, you might have heard of things like sundown towns after Reconstruction, where African Americans were not allowed to reside in places or even remain in places after the sun went down. Racial zoning explicitly emerged sometime around the turn of the 20th century as a way to further subjugate Black people. I'm going to read a quote from the mayor of Baltimore when he's talking about racial zoning and the intentionality behind it, because it's very explicit. He said, "Blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority." So very clear about the intentions here. The Supreme Court struck down this explicit zoning in a case called Buchanan v. Worley in 1917. But then people got really creative, right? They found a number of other ways to keep this separation going. In 1916, there were 8 exclusionary zoning or zoning policies on the books in cities. And by 1936, there were over 1,200. So what cities and localities turned to was a system of exclusionary zoning that essentially said, you cannot build homes here if they're under a certain lot size, or multifamily housing cannot be built here. The house has to be a particular size, which effectively shut out Black and brown people from being able to live in certain neighborhoods. At the same time, layered on top of this, there were things like restrictive racial covenants, where white families would, before selling their house or when buying their house, would say, you cannot resell this house to a person of particular races. This practice was not officially struck down by the Supreme Court until 1948 in a case called Shelley v. Kramer. But then even today, you'll find unenforceable, but still some of these laws on the books and covenants, right? So the major thing that you guys might have heard of is redlining. And again, a lot of this stuff was happening simultaneously. So the FHA manual explicitly warned against insuring homes in racially mixed neighborhoods, and refused to provide loans to people looking for housing in predominantly black and brown spaces. Those were called red zones, which is where the term redlining comes from. Layered on top of that was a campaign of racial violence that happened that was not officially made illegal until the Fair Housing Act. A number of us think about the Fair Housing Act as sort of the panacea for a lot of this, but unfortunately, it didn't completely solve the problem, largely because it wasn't ever fully enforced, and also because it doesn't look at the deeper economic aspects, because like I mentioned earlier, people do find a way to continue to discriminate against people by race by using people's economic status and by continuing to criminalize and exclude poverty. So I know there are a number, all of you guys are experts in this history. Free to add, amend, correct.
I would just add the influence of the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges. That was a coordinated effort by the national organization to specifically instruct real estate agents and brokers to not contribute to the mixing of races. They created a model restricted covenant policy so that this could be used by brokers and agents and individuals. So it was really a concerted effort in addition to the government side, but also on the private. It developed with the private real estate industry, and that, as you've said, has continued to affect the local markets today.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing the history. Braden, your exhibit is about educating communities on the history of redlining, which we spoke a little bit about. Can you briefly explain to us what is Undesigned the Red Line? And how did you and your co-founder, April, come up with the idea, and why is this format such a critical education tool?
Sure, yes, and thank you so much for having me. As you said, so April and I, a few years ago, created this exhibit, and we, with some others, Sabrina, who's in Boston, and to the points that you were just making, this exhibit kind of tries to unearth how structural racism really gets designed into cities and places through urban policy and, just in about every possible way. And in that moment, right, when redlining gets created, it's part of the New Deal, right? So we're creating the social safety net, we're creating middle-class wealth building system, and home ownership as we know it is really getting invented in this moment as well, kind of the financialized wealth building tool of home ownership in many respects. But, right, we want to exclude, and right now, in this moment in the 1930s in the US, it's also a huge era of white supremacy thinking in US policy, including economics at Harvard, et cetera, who, just a quote from a real estate textbook, okay, and we give this tour of the exhibit often, and so I more or less remember this quote. But the real estate textbook, and mind you, this is, okay, if you're going to be a realtor, this is on your test, okay, which says, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forgo their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives, right? And this is coming from big economic thinking to say this is how we're going to preserve property value. And still today, right, that mentality is familiar to us, right, about where does housing get placed, who gets to live where, and what its effects are on people's property value. And so that system is completely entangled in this racial history, and it continues to perpetuate it. So the exhibit kind of unearths this. It's visual, it's interactive. It's really about creating a gathering point for people to have this conversation as an organizing tool. Believe it or not, it's just 4 floors below us. One of the copies is at Enterprise Community Partners, and we're very happy to have it there. But there's, I think, probably 15 copies currently right now. Some in New York, in cities all over the country, Cleveland, Chicago, or Boston City Hall, Atlanta, LA, but in each place delving into the local history as well and bringing forward kind of the stories of people's own stories of that experience and the local history. Each place seems to both be deeply affected by this history, of course, on a national scale, and somehow contribute to it. So you mentioned Baltimore. Baltimore actually is a huge incubator for this thinking. Mayor Mahul, who you quoted, comes up with racial zoning. It's struck down, but not because of equal protection. It's struck down because, well, this is violating private property owners' rights to sell to whomever they please. And that's when you get racial covenants as a private agreement becoming kind of the replacement of that. And the federal government comes out and says, during the New Deal, those restrictive deeds are great. That's what we want to see because that's going to preserve home value. And this system becomes, yes, a system of hyper-segregation and a system of wealth destruction, I think, which was mentioned earlier about the report, which is key. And they're completely interconnected, and you really have to address both. So yes, the exhibit is about this kind of truth and reconciliation. And then, we do, as a company and with our partners, a lot of work into actual undoing. What are the systems and structures and designs, and how do we come to those solutions? So a lot of focus on process as well. How do we democratize that? And who's at the table, et cetera.
So thinking of solutions and how we could address this problem, Kimberly, you recently wrote a report on the black-white housing gap. So can you give us the highlights of the key policy solutions that you suggested?
Sure. So like my colleague Rick mentioned, we have several ideas of how to attack this, but I'm just going to mention a few. Our public policy solutions are working, or hopefully are seeking to undesign, both undesign segregation, as Braden would say, but also responding to the ways that it remains persistent, so sort of low-hanging fruit and larger systemic thinking. One of the first key things that we talk about in the report is implementing rigorously the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but it's very important. Essentially, AFFH charges the Department of Housing and Urban Development with taking meaningful actions that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers to access for people from protected classes. And it also seeks to actively replace segregated living patterns with integrated ones. And I think what a lot of people don't realize about the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is that this idea, this mandate, was baked into the Fair Housing Act and was simply never acted upon. Right now, it's under attack by the current administration. Surprise, surprise. But in order to start some of this undoing, that rule needs to be implemented and needs the technical support for cities and localities to make sure that they're doing that well. Also, we talk about needing to invest and recognize the importance of fair housing testers. Those are people who go into rental properties or talk to realtors who don't necessarily or don't actually have an intent to purchase or rent, but are seeking to root out and identify discrimination. And what we found is in places where this has happened, this is pretty plentiful. Discrimination is pretty common. Recently, the city of Chicago did this. They looked at 70-something properties, and of those 70, they found 30 cases of discrimination, either by source of income discrimination, which is not necessarily protected under the Fair Housing Act, though it ought to be, and racial discrimination. So we also need, in addition to that, strong and persistent enforcement that combats lending discrimination. A few years ago, the federal government found that big banks were steering Black and brown borrowers into much riskier loan products than their credit worthiness would indicate that they would be eligible for. And this was systemic, it was long-standing. These cases are difficult to root out, but there is precedent for them being rooted out, and there needs to be federal support for that. Some of the bigger ideas that we have are really sort of reassessing and re-examining the way that we do zoning in this country. So Rick and I talk about ways to limit, disincentivize, or even eliminate economically exclusionary zoning, which is what I talked about earlier in the history, saying a lot size has to be a particular size, or a house has to be a particular type. Policies, one policy could be reducing the amount of mortgage interest that a family can deduct if they're living in jurisdictions that practice exclusionary zoning. Rick has written extensively about an Economic Fair Housing Act, which while it would not insulate someone from the market, it would ensure that localities are not discriminating by income when people are seeking to purchase homes. We also discuss inclusionary zoning practices, which is where a developer has to set aside a portion of housing for lower moderate income renters or residents. And finally, we start to delve into thinking about gentrification. And I'll mention one major thing about that. We call for a reconsideration of the way tax abatements are working. Tax abatements essentially say new development or major renovations, new buildings in communities that need to be revitalized or changed in some way, you're free from paying taxes on that property for X amount of years, for 10 years. I think that's pretty common. And essentially what that does is it allows wealthy people who often happen to be overwhelmingly white, who are going into oftentimes communities of color, to exist in those communities without, at least financially, contributing to the well-being of that community. Their taxes, their property taxes, they're not going to the schools, they're not going to the parks, they're not going to sanitation, right? While members of those communities, businesses, Black-owned, minority-owned businesses are not getting that benefit of the doubt while they're seeking to and successfully revitalizing their communities. So we should really think critically about why we're doing that and how to change and amend that. So I'm happy to talk about some more of our ideas, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Great, thank you for sharing all of those. Marie, you recently worked on a statewide source of income discrimination bill. Can you explain that legislation, talk a little bit about why it's important and the process of advocating for it? Also, what role does zoning play in housing inequity?
Sure. First off, for the source of income discrimination bill, that was a coalition. Enterprise was leading it with Fair Housing Justice Center and Racism, but it was a coalition of over 100. Sure. It was a coalition of over 100 groups, or
Yes.
about 100 groups that advocated for this bill to pass. So Lorraine can talk more about that coalition. I can talk a little bit about the bill. It's the Lawful Source of Income Non-Discrimination Act of 2019, and that amends the New York State human rights law to say that landlords or other housing providers cannot discriminate against renters based on their source of income, which means that if you have a Section 8 voucher, if you have disability benefits, veteran benefits, child support, anything that is legal, non-wage income, landlords are not allowed to say, I don't take Section 8 vouchers, I'm not going to accept your child support as income, and therefore you don't meet the income requirements and I can refuse housing to you. That is no longer possible across the state, statewide. Before the law was passed, certain municipalities like New York City had amended their own human rights laws to prevent source of income discrimination, but statewide that was not the case. So that's why this law is very important, because some municipalities had narrower exceptions than the state law, and so the state law provides more protection for renters than certain municipalities who had the law, and some municipalities didn't have any source of income protection, so now it's all renters across the state now have those protections. So that's basically the bill. I don't know whether you want to talk
Yeah.
about.
I'll
The
add a
coalition.
little context from the coalition perspective. As Marie mentioned, we started in 2016 with probably 30 organizations. We're able to grow to over 100 organizations statewide advocating for the amendment of the human rights law. And to put into context, once you all have had an opportunity to come to the 11th floor to experience the Undesigned the Red Line exhibit, it really will help you to understand why this legislation was critically important. So when you look at the concentration of poverty, which really still today aligns with those communities that were red zoned, keeping people within those particular areas of a community where there's less likely to have access to better schools, low crime, better community amenities, and other instances that just make for a more just well-rounded lifestyle. What happens is, even in cities like New York, where there had been laws on the books, some up towards a decade, the enforcement component was really lax, and you still had individuals and families who were being discriminated against. So here you have this federal resource that was really designed to enable families to have the ability to be mobile. So if I choose to stay in this community where I grew up in, then that's my choice. But if I choose and I can afford with my housing voucher or with other legal non-wage income, then I have the ability to go to another community. And so without the risk of a landlord discriminating against me because of the income that I was using in which to pay for my rent. One of the things to also note is that absent a lawful source of income protection, this type of discrimination was often a proxy for protected classes. So in particular, people of color, children with families with children were often targeted, but targeted in a way where we'll blame it on the Section 8 voucher, we'll blame it on the child support, a way in which someone was meaning to use and pay for their rent. What's important now, and this was really a huge success after even a decade of advocacy at the state level. This legislation had come close after passing both houses and then being vetoed by Governor Patterson. But now that we have the legislation on the books, very similar to what happened to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the law is only as good as it's enforced. And so our coalition is now transitioning from a campaign initially of hashtag ban income bias NY to hashtag end income bias NY, where we're going to focus more so on the education outreach and then the enforcement component. Part of the enforcement, to Kimberly's comment, includes ensuring that our fair housing groups have resources that they can do fair housing testing to sort of weed out and unveil where discrimination is taking place. But we also want to make sure that the enforcement agency of the state, the New York State Division of Human Rights, has appropriate resources that they can enforce the law so that we can ensure that people aren't discriminated against and that they have the ability to live where they can afford.
So to go back to your question about zoning and housing equality, Kimberly talked a little bit about in the report about suggestions on alleviating housing equality that occurs through zoning, but basically local zoning ordinance are replicating the same issues that we see historically in reinforcing residential segregation patterns. So like Kimberly mentioned, there are zoning ordinances, especially in the tri-state area, that simply prevent the construction of multifamily housing. That means that there will be no affordable housing built in that community unless those zoning ordinances are changed. There are zoning ordinances that create restrictive requirements on affordable housing, such as residency requirements that say you have to have lived a certain amount of time in this community to qualify for affordable housing. Well, if your community is 99% white, then you know that who's going to qualify for that new affordable housing opportunities, then it's only people who have lived in the community. Sometimes employment There will be employment preferences as well, that you have to work for the city, and all of these, as Lorraine has mentioned, can be a proxy for race or other protected classes. So in that way, you will see local zoning ordinances reinforce the segregation. The Fair Housing Justice Center has brought a lot of cases over the past decade in Westchester County, Nassau County, suburban counties, where you are seeing this type of zoning ordinance be replicated over the past decade. And so those are some of the main situations where you will see the zoning code replicate those same segregation patterns.
Yeah, thank you. Lorraine, can you help us understand the difference between fair housing and affordable housing, and any work you've done at Enterprise to address affordable housing?
Sure. In its simplest form, when we often think affordable housing, it's within the context of either the creation or rehabilitation of housing that is affordable to low, moderate income individuals. So when you think about, HUD gives standards of area median income. So for the city of New York, we're part of a broader MSA, which includes suburban counties. And that you have a median income based off of that, and then you take certain percentages. So at 30% and below, that's considered extremely low income, and then it goes up in different increments. But basically ensuring that no one is spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So in its simplest form, that's what affordable housing is, and then also you couple that with programs that are funded at both the federal, state level, and sometimes there's also resources at the local level. Fair housing, on the other hand, is really more in the context of when you think the Fair Housing Act. So it's more of a legal perspective in terms of ensuring that certain individuals aren't legally discriminated against based on whatever their protected class might be. So initially at the federal level, there were 5 protected classes from the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So that included race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. And then over time, additional classes were included, familial status and disability. And then outside of the federal protected classes, you also have state and local governments that add additional protected classes. So source of income would be one of those additions that's occurred at the state of New York, while we have a number of municipalities that have added not only source of income, but other protected classes as well. And so from fair housing perspective, again, just thinking in terms of how can we ensure that housing discrimination isn't occurring for these individuals. Enterprise and Fair Housing Justice Center during the fall of 2017 co-convened a regional affordable and fair housing roundtable. And what we were able to do was bring together over 30 organizations that fell either in one of those buckets as an affordable houser or a fair houser, or a related organization. So for example, organizations dealing with LGBTQ community, with seniors, individuals with disabilities. And while some would think that these groups, they should really be in agreement all the time, they sort of, their movements birth around the same time, that's really not the case. And so it really was a challenge as co-conveners, but we knew it was something necessary, particularly what was happening at the federal landscape, but quite frankly, even outside of that. So when you think back to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we had 50 years for some administration to really get it right. But now we really see an intentional rollback in its impact. So it was an opportunity for these organizations to come together to do some cross-education and cross-learning, and then also more intentionally put together a shared policy agenda. What can we agree to? In some instances, there are items that may not necessarily agree 100%, but at least the concept and the idea is something that as affordable housers and fair housers, we really want to address. And so after a year of literally blood, sweat, and tears I'll share a quick story just to give you an idea as to how our initial meeting started. So one of our participants who's from Long Island, and she was from the Fair Housers, she leads a civil rights organization. She shared a story about, what some of the conditions were on Long Island, particularly from a racial segregation perspective. And she talked about how a local official, the wife of a local official, was in a pizza shop, and I guess there were people, maybe their children running around or something, but she was disturbed. And she looks at the person who's with her and says, I really wish we had picked our own cotton. So here you have the wife of an elected official. This is the message that she's bringing. And this is the context or the environment that people are having to live and survive in and around. So that was an eye-opener for us, and we knew that it was not only an opportunity for us to come together and break down barriers, but it was an opportunity for us to really work together and impact change. So our year together, our initial year, I should say, together concluded with the summit where we were able to share with up to 400 of our partners throughout the New York metropolitan region what our experience was like over the course of those 12 months, and to also shed light on some of the policy recommendations that we were able to come up and agree with. What that report is, you might ask. Closing the divide. What's within this document, again, is there are a number of policy recommendations, some that are impactful or could potentially be impactful at the state level, and others that are at the local or regional level. But it really looks at different topics from both an affordable and fair housing perspective. So having these different groups come together and in some instances negotiate, okay, this aspect of a particular recommendation doesn't necessarily make sense. We should view it from this angle, or there are other things that need to be taken into consideration. And so very similar to with the source of income, which is one of the policy recommendations that we have in here, it's how do we convert paper to action? So it's mobilizing these different organizations and hoping that some will be willing to take risks and be willing to step out and take a stand on, okay, this is something that is really important to our organization, our mission, and we're willing to take the lead, who's with us. And we saw that with source of income. Rent regulations was historic for the state of New York in the 2019 legislative session. That was another idea that's in here. We also highlight mobility counseling, which I know is in the report that Kimberly and Rick did, and there are numerous others. So it's really being able to look at the power that can come out of when you bring these different factions together, and then also how we can challenge ourselves to ensure that we're making a difference, not only for the residents here in the city of New York, but throughout the New York City metro region and across the state.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll actually be including a copy of the report in our thank you email, so if you want to take a look at that, you certainly can. We're actually now going to be transitioning to our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And yeah.
It's working, yes. Hi, good evening. My name is Albert Golson, and I focus a lot on urban security issues. Could you please elaborate on the so-called eminent domain, how that has been abused both by local governments in collaboration with real estate companies as a tool for displacement of black and brown residents, and also affordable housing is kind of a catch-all phrase. People don't really look at the terms and conditions with a particular project in which the definition of what affordable housing might be in terms of dollars and cents, as well as the terms and conditions in which affordable housing is not kind of a permanent fixture. It does have a particular duration. If you can just elaborate on what you might know about those situations, I would greatly appreciate it.
I'm happy to address the second part of the question. I don't know if anyone wants to take the first part, eminent domain.
Well, I could say, I mean, historically, I'm not that terribly familiar with an example of that happening in our region in a more recent way, but yes, historically, you see through urban renewal policy and all these other things, the literal physical destruction of many, many neighborhoods. A great documentary that I really think is worth watching on all these fronts is Capri Green, 70 Acres in Chicago. But that traces from that era of urban renewal all the way up until today when they did, Capri Green was a large public housing, which they knocked down to do mixed income. It problematizes and questions and is critical of all those different systems and how they play out, particularly when it comes to, they're like, oh, we have the subsidized people and the market rate people and the low income, and the way that this plays out in communities where the attitudes, like this council person you mentioned, are still there. So I really recommend that, and I think it elucidates some of those points, and I'll let you.
I can mention, at least a more current issue is what we're looking at in my community in East Harlem with the 2nd Avenue subway. The first phase happened in the Upper East Side, and once they redid the environmental assessment for East Harlem Phase 2, which is not yet funded, there are a lot more properties compared to the Upper East Side that MTA is looking to take for eminent domain. And when we were talking about the displacement of residential homes versus the Upper East Side, the MTA is always talking about finding comparable accommodations within the city. And in East Harlem, that's almost impossible to find, that level of rents. Where are those people going to be moved to? So those are the types of issues that we're looking at in East Harlem, which has also been just recently rezoned.
And if I could, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but to paraphrase the question that you asked to me that says, affordable for whom? And that often comes up, particularly as I was mentioning how we break down or how HUD determines what an area median income in. There are or have been numerous upon numerous conversations about why is the city of New York included in an MSA that also has Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, Rockland, Putnam County. So higher income counties, especially when you go down to a neighborhood level and oftentimes even within a neighborhood, a community board or census tract level. And quite frankly, that's a challenge. It's a challenge in terms of, what's the funding resources and subsidies necessary to ensure that there's an opportunity to be able to create new affordable housing that is affordable for individuals within that community as opposed to constructing, and we touch on this in some of our advocacy effort with prevailing wage this year, where we had the conversation of, how is it that we have construction workers who are working on affordable housing developments and they can't afford to live in the affordable housing development? And it's an issue and a concern. Some of the policy recommendations that have been thrown out, not a lot of them that have really gotten teeth, but should we have a census tract level AMI, or is it neighborhood? Just the thought of how do you, one, is it legal? And then two, how would that be managed as things would change over time? But it certainly is something that we discussed in our policy shop at Enterprise. We're having conversations with our partners as to how do we address these concerns that council members are being bombarded by their residents, state legislators are being bombarded by their residents. When we talk gentrification and what's happening in communities, I live in central Brooklyn. I'm not a native New Yorker, but to walk on the street or to go to my children's school, some people don't know the difference, and you can even tell by the way some will treat my family, and it's like, oh, this is what we're dealing with here. And to really see how, if that's what I'm experiencing, what about the family who is now in a shelter because they were priced out of their apartment, or they were forced out or harassed out? So it's an issue. I don't know what the magic answer is, but I know it's something that we have to continue particularly here in the city of New York, have to continue to work hard to figure out how we address that.
Hi, thank you. Just on that last point, I'm wondering, this is definitely overgeneralizing here, but when communities start to gentrify, at first it can seem like that is working to integrate that neighborhood. And that seems to offer a lot of promise and potential. But then it seems that, it reaches a tipping point and people are displaced and it's no longer integrated. It's flipped over to the other side. I'm wondering if any of you have ideas on policies, or if you know of places that are working to kind of leverage that movement towards like the beginning of gentrification, but then stopping it before it turns bad.
Well, I'll throw out a couple of ideas, and I'll be creative in using the words of others, so that if any of you go back to the enterprise folks, like Lorraine said that on the panel, but it was in someone else's report. But rent regulation, again, the historic bills that were passed during the 2019 legislation, I think are going to have a big impact on trying to ensure that within those communities where you have rent stabilized developments, that you try to stabilize those developments, or stabilize that community. One of the things I believe also Kimberly and Rick highlight in their report, it's the difference between revitalization and colonization. And that's, how do you prevent that from happening? Because I think at the onset, particularly as we talk economic integration, that's a good thing. We don't want the concentration of poverty. But what happens when that economic integration turns into the local business within that community? The newcomers really don't want to visit that particular business. And so that business over time is either priced out, because if they don't own the building, the rent becomes too high, they're forced to move, and then a new business comes in that really doesn't speak to the needs of existing residents. So definitely a struggle. I'll pull from one of the items in addition to the rent regulation that has been highlighted by others within Richard Rothstein's book. He talks about how can we really go above and beyond from a property tax perspective. And it's like, why not freeze property taxes? So you talk about the tax abatement for, the rental developments, or, for the newer developments that are going up. But what would freezing the property taxes for the homeowners who have been in that community and who could probably financially, when we think of the 400 years of, what's the word you used earlier, deconcentration or deconstruction of wealth? When you look at that, that over the 400 years, that particularly Black people, but then over time you have other people of color who've come to this country, they could benefit from the increase in equity, but why should they have to be forced to leave because they can't afford the rise in property taxes? So I think those two, something that could help to address renters, but then also help to address homeowners. And then also to the gentleman's initial question, when we're talking affordable housing, what do those newer developments that are deemed affordable housing, who are they housing? How can we ensure that we're hitting multiple different income levels?
I'll just point out one of the sort of an addition to some of the things that you mentioned. An example would be in Philadelphia, which has its own problems with tax abatements and gentrification, the rapidly changing city. One thing that they did is implement something called, let me make sure I'm getting it right, the Long-Term Owners Occupancy Program, which helps long-term sort of legacy residents in communities pay their taxes, right? And so if you're under 150% of AMI, however that's defined, right? The government will help you pay those property taxes or cap them at a particular amount. What they found is that the people that are benefiting from that program are mostly long-term homeowners that are senior citizens, that are black and brown that would have otherwise not had the liquidity to like pay those taxes and are now able to stay in their areas. But on a broader note, I really love your question. I was in a community meeting a few weeks ago, and an older lady in her 70s, who, or maybe even in her late 70s, and was born and raised in DC, which is where I live, actually cried saying that she didn't feel well. She had lived in this neighborhood and she looked around and didn't feel welcome in that neighborhood. And not to get too individualistic because we're talking in structures here, but one thing is a lot of us are gentrifiers, right? Like we are the people who are higher income, moving into neighborhoods where we don't have a history, frequent black businesses, fight for justice, include people who are in that neighborhood in the conversations about what new businesses get to be in that space. Send your children to the local schools, right? Don't send them off to private schools. Engage in all aspects of your life in that community so that you're not colonizing it, you're participating in it. And I think just as far as how people relate to their space, that makes a difference. It's not a structural solution by any means, but I think there are ways to attack gentrification, but it's going to exist for the time being. There are ways to be better gentrifiers, quite frankly, that we need to hold ourselves accountable for.
One thing that I just also want to touch on is that in a really big, we really have to take a much stronger, I think, and much bolder moves are going to be required to address this whole history. Though the wealth destruction is huge. So when investment starts to pour back into a gentrifying neighborhood, which is driven almost entirely by speculation, and it happens often long before you start to notice or be able to see and detect those things. Like, you know, how do we shift and really focus on community wealth building as mechanisms, broad-based ownership mechanisms like community land trust, looking at things like a community fund where we can subsidize ownership and bond and shareholdership of people who are living there that can begin investing in that existing economy. A lot of local businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods who've been there forever still can't get financing. But if a white person comes in and says, I'm opening a cafe, ooh, they get financing right away. And so, but you might have the record shop or the whatever it is, local place has been there forever, want to, you know, spruce up their store, and this essentially you have redlining going on. And I think if you have something like a fund that people buy into, or even subsidize that they're, you know, we do some reparative wealth building that can then start to build that economy, right? Because part of the thing that I just want to point out, last thing I'll say, even when we talk about things like moving to opportunity or being able to move to other neighborhoods, right, to access opportunity, well, that can distract us from saying, well, why isn't there opportunity there? Why is that, like, is that always, are we always going to say, well, we've given up and that's just going to be a bad neighborhood that people want their ticket out? So we have to do that, though, it takes really big moves, I think. Structural moves in ownership, in wealth building, reparations, these things.
In the battery.
Good evening. First of all, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and insight about this topic. I live in Washington, D.C. myself, so the examples I can use are from Washington, D.C. Some of these gentrification or urban renewal projects are actually directly started because of the legislation, such as LaFont Plaza in Washington, D.C. was originally a legislation passed by the U.S. Congress in 1964, which driven away one of the biggest African American communities in Washington, D.C. at the time, replacing it with a relatively empty, not so beautiful office block buildings at this stage. My question is, what are some of the things that on the legislative level or administrative level, in the government level, that could be done to actually prevent driven out some of the relatively lower income or ethnically minorities groups in the regions? Thank you.
We have a lot of ideas. We have a lot of ideas.
Very excited, very excited.
But no, honestly, I think it's some of the things that we've already mentioned. I think to Braden's point, it takes electing bold and brave elected officials, the policymakers. It takes advocates coming together to rally around and to rally around the change that they want to see. As we go back through the history, if it was intentional social engineering that caused what we see today now, hundreds of years later past or after some of these policies were put in place, then it's going to take just that in order to make change. So whether it's some property tax reform that is intentional on saying this group of people who have been disenfranchised, there's something that we have to do to address those specific people. That's property tax reform. It's from the exclusionary and inclusionary zoning. How do we fight for and ensure that in certain communities that we have affordable housing that's being developed? Out of all of this, I think it also goes back to what Braden said. It's very much an economic conversation, and we can't just talk bricks and mortar and think that that's going to change things. It's really from a overall community development perspective, and it's what are we doing about making the shift and the change with the wealth gap, with the economic gap, with all those other academic gaps, all those gaps that exist, and acknowledging why. And also just give a shout out to Washington, D.C., as I'm a proud alumna of Howard University. And gentrification George pissed me off when he said that we should pick up our institution and move it. For those of you who don't know who he is, Google it. But it's, it's looking at what's happening in the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and how that's changed since I left campus. I know it's alarming. The problem is it's not just D.C., it's not just New York, it's not just Philadelphia. Pick your city, urban America, and it's happening.
I think we also have to be willing to ask ourselves the hard, deep questions. And one question that I want to pose just out here is, why is it that when we're talking about putting affordable housing in particular neighborhoods, oftentimes affluent white neighborhoods, there's an opportunity for that community. It's built into the process of deciding where this housing is going to go. There's an opportunity for the community to express their discontent, and that is factored into the determination of where that housing goes. Why is it that we don't hear about that in Black and brown communities? Why is that? And I think it's because we do not trust Black, brown, and poor people with self-governance. And I think we need to address that sin of American society as a part of moving forward. It's not a concrete policy solution, but I think it's a core question that we need to grapple with when thinking about public policy.
I think some of the policy suggestions that address that, especially in New York City, there's a coalition, the Thriving Communities Coalition, that is suggesting charter revision to insist that New York City have a comprehensive plan. And when we talk about comprehensive planning, and especially through a fair housing lens, then you are looking at, you don't have those spot decisions like the example in DC. If you have looked at what your vision is for a city as a whole, you don't let places that are almost like a blank slate, like Long Island City, develop without talking about, well, what would be equitable to develop there? How can the city look at policies that will affect equitable development in places where there's an opportunity? And an example in New York of like you just said was on Union Square, 14th Street, where you have the opportunity to build what was presented as a tech hub. Well, when the RFP went out, it was, we don't want to see residential development here. So what does that mean when the city has different strategic plans that say, in this neighborhood, we're not looking for residential development, we want to see an economic development project, but in this neighborhood, this is where we want affordable housing. So I really think some of looking at bold steps is taking a look through the fair housing assessment that New York City has gone ahead with doing, despite of the federal government saying that we're holding back, and really looking at the city's policies and how comprehensively it is equitable.
There's one question I just wanted to add, because that's what I was thinking, to come back to. Kimberly mentioned it earlier, is the affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think when that is done in the manner in which under the Obama administration, where it was more inclusive, it was more intentional, it was not only data driven, but it was supposed to operate that it was people driven, and to for a minute take it out of a black and white context, but it's thinking about individuals who are disabled, it's thinking about families, it's thinking about all those protected classes, all those people who are marginalized in some form or fashion, making sure that they're part of the conversation and ensuring that as plans are being created, whether it's federal plans or local plans, that they're taking into consideration how do we want our community to look, who do we want to be included in that plan, and how do we have the courage to actually execute that plan?
So unfortunately, I have no more time for questions. Sorry.
No, it's sort of, sorry, I'm concerned though about where when the rental assistance administration said that on the developments that have been sold to the private sector and or if people get priced out of the ability to afford if there's a rent upgrade, how about housing preservation and development in the Section 8 vouchers? I mean, can you speak briefly about that? Because what have people encountered when in the case where if there are public properties sold or they get gentrified or rents are upgraded, because HPD is the other large housing agency in the area of New York City and has Section 8 vouchers, so what's going on? It's kind of hard to imagine that here now where there's a product quote-unquote by the government to enable people to remain in their apartments, because they have the homeowners assistance programs with the rent, with the federal government provides Section 8 vouchers. So, and there's not a lot of public housing stock here in New York City, and some of those developments are now being sold to the private sector. But I know that there are Section 8 vouchers and a whole other agency that does it. So, what can you speak to that?
I don't want to speak for HPD, so I guess just understanding better the concern and the question. You can just.
When an apartment owner is in an area where if their housing development, their apartment goes out, the development gets sold to the private sector and the rents get upgraded, or for some reason or another they live in an area that is gentrified and they can demonstrate that there's a gap in what the new rents are going to be when the rents are upgraded. Housing preservation development is the delivery mechanism here in New York City for Section 8 vouchers. Why would there be? I know that there's wait lists. But why would there be a problem with when a homeowner's faced with a rent increase? I'm sorry, an apartment owner's faced with a renter is faced with the increase in rent, or the development gets sold to the private sector, and they are going to be demonstrating that there's a gap in what they have the ability to pay in rent versus what the rent upgrade is going to be. Housing preservation development is again they're the sluice, they're the delivery mechanism. So in New York, I mean, I guess it's just a timing difference.
Well, it sounds like you're even referring to not only a timing difference, but a resource difference. So where's the gap?
Yeah, the government comes in. I suppose there's a limit. That might be part of the problem. Because HUD, which is the grantors for Section 8 vouchers, if they've limited the amount of vouchers available, or
Right.
the ability for there to be a Section 8
And how much the voucher is worth also. I mean, that's part of the challenge.
It's
So.
part of the coordination process with
Yeah.
HPD.
Can I just, I'm really sorry. I just want to know about how, when you talk about community and neighborhoods, we don't have to do it now. Just
Yeah, there's going to be a wine and cheese reception afterwards. So for all your questions, you can ask them afterwards. There's plenty of time to do that. But I really want to thank all of the panelists for being here. Yeah. And my colleague Anna is going to close us off today.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's a lovely evening. As Tabby mentioned, I'm Anna Gu. I'm another summer scholar here at TCF. I work on labor policy. As a closing thought, I just want to remind everybody that you can stay up to date on future TCF events by joining the mailing list at tcf.org. Please join us again for our next Think, Drink, Mingle. We're going to discuss the role of big data, big data in digital organizing, and that information will be available on the website. Thank you once again. I don't want to keep you from the wine and cheese. Please enjoy and have a very good night.
Thank you all.